Can I begin, though, by acknowledging our First Nations peoples? We have been in proud partnership at the Victorian Women's Trust with Koori Women Mean Business now for a quarter of a century, and Leanne Miller, proud Yorta Yorta woman who heads up that enterprise. She says that the partnership between her Indigenous organisation and our non-Indigenous organisation is unrivalled in terms of two women's organisations standing shoulder to shoulder for a quarter of a century, and I say that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of effective reconciliation. But I want to speak today, and I think being able to give an address at an august gathering like this is a time not to tell you how to suck eggs, but for you to pause, to stop and think deeply, more deeply than you might have yesterday, about some of the deep, deep values that underpin the act of volunteering and its importance to the fabric of this country. The Women's Trust is a small outfit. We rarely rate more than 10 employees, so our ability to actually have volunteers is limited numerically because we work very hard on making sure that our volunteers are a crucial part of our endeavour and are well supported and respected. So I wanted to start by, and I think I sent these through to Shelley, that years ago we tried to encapsulate our own philosophic and ethical position about volunteering by casting our 10 golden rules. So I'll just read them really quickly. Mutual respect, trust and decency underpin office and project practice. The lived experience and wisdom of people is acknowledged and appreciated. There is reciprocal value adding when it comes to volunteers and interns. Real work, real tasks, real application that is purposeful and rewarding. A creative fit is sought and found between volunteers, interns and our organisation. This requires close listening, discussion of interests and background and imaginative allocation to tasks, supporting people with good orientation where appropriate training. Volunteers and interns are constructively supported into working semi-autonomously. Volunteers and interns should not be placed in positions or on tasks within the organisation that places them under a management or decision-making responsibility or liability. We trust the common sense and capacity of volunteers and interns and work to their best sides. Volunteers and interns need to genuinely feel that they are part of the show. They only sit in our reception foyer on their first meeting. And finally, remember that the greatest asset of any organisation is its people, and volunteers and interns are part of that asset base worthy of investment. That was years ago, and it's probably a little bit dated in some respects, although we still practice by it. I also have the privilege of chairing Fitted for Work, which is an organisation that I think many of you will know. And Fitted for Work, so far in its 13-year history, has helped 28,000 women get work and keep work. And the reason they've been able to make that massive change to a lot of women's lives is because it has a staff about the size of the Women's Trust, but it has a volunteer force of 300 women in the Melbourne office alone. So we're big, we're small, but volunteers everywhere in this country are big. According to the great information that Volunteer Victoria provides as background, there are millions of volunteers across this country. Victoria alone has an estimated over 1.5 million. All age groups pretty much covered, especially 15 plus. There are slightly more women than men who volunteer. Many volunteers have a disability or long-term health condition. There are significant numbers of volunteers who are born overseas, and there is a significant number who speak a language other than English at home. There are a significant number of retirees. Many volunteers do so at least once a week. It has been estimated there's something like 9 million volunteer involvements in any year in this country. People mainly volunteer in a range of organisations, but focused largely on welfare and community organisations, education and training, religious, sports and recreation organisations. And additionally, there are, as Volunteer Victoria describes them, spontaneous volunteers, those who, for example, step up to the plate at times of bushfires or other disasters. And there are also numbers of volunteers whose employers allow them to do so on paid work time. So all up, it's been estimated that in dollar terms alone, hours by average wage, that the contribution is somewhere around 19 billion annually. But Lisa O'Dwyer has estimated that if you look at the overall value of volunteering and its multiplier effects, we are talking in any year, socially, economically, in at least, close to something like 300 billion contribution to our society and economy. But these stats, these broad brush indicators, they point to something deeper at play. And we often, I think, we just have to be careful and not just keep on thinking or talking statistically, because it masks the very important values that lie underneath and need to be nourished and sustained. So it's timely to check on these underpinnings to volunteering so that you and myself, that we can recommit, re-energise and redouble our efforts to get positive outcomes when volunteers come into organisations. I've read a lot of definitions of volunteering in my time, but it wasn't actually until getting ready for this talk that I came across the one in Volunteering Australia's documentation in July 2015 with their new definition of volunteering, that volunteering is time willingly given for the common good and without financial gain. Volunteering is time willingly given for the common good and without financial gain. So I want to address the rest of my talk to exploring a little bit with you this idea of the common good, because it's something that is tacit, it lurks with intent, and I think it's timely that we bring it up to the surface and appreciate its power. And it also, in my view, in getting ready for this talk, that you can't talk about diversity, you can't talk about diversity by gender, by disability, by sexuality, by ethnicity, without understanding this notion of the common good. It's almost as though you're clapping with one hand if you don't actually situate the issues around diversity and inclusion within this broader philosophical and ethical framework. The common good is a powerful ethic. It's been threading its way through civilization for centuries, from Aristotle especially, to his notion of polis, right through to more contemporary and distinguished contributions from exponents such as John Rawls. The principle, hard to define in a nutshell, but the principle of the common good assumes shared benefit, that a well-ordered and functioning society creates conditions that are equally to everyone's advantage, that the good of each person is intimately linked to the good of the whole community, that people flourish when there's positive social connection, where there's unity, and where everyone benefits from collective and cooperative effort and the formation of shared will. The common good has a powerful moral force to it because it's underpinned by respect for the dignity and worth of every person, not just some. Regard for the well-being of all in a community, even if you don't like them. The promotion and protection of the common good occurs and should occur at all levels of life, socially, politically, culturally, economically, at all levels of organisations, all levels of life, all levels of community existence. At work, in practice, if it's flourishing as a powerful moral force, it offers a terrific antidote to domination, exploitation, corruption, ugly self-interest, and in fact social dysfunction. You see the common good as an ethic permeating through our society over decades, the way it has led to us developing welfare pillars, an 8-hour day, education, public education systems, a health system that is meant to be affordable to all. Our justice systems are meant to translate the common good into practice and fairness for all. Our political and policy institutions, indeed our democracy, is founded on this important ethic of trying to affect the common good. But the notion of the common good is not politically neutral. It's not a sanitised thing that somehow flips and flops around people's lives. We choose to operate within this paradigm. We make a deliberate, conscious choice in terms of our value schema, that's where we fit comfortably. And some would say, including Mr. Kennett, from the time he and I locked horns 20 years or so ago, some would say that I've been banging on about this for some time. And why I do is because I'm very comfortably situated, not complacently, but it feels right to me as a paradigm to live my personal and professional life. But there's a struggle always over the assertion and the suppression of the common good. It's not a straightforward acceptance of a political and philosophical ethic. There are obstacles in its way. People will say, we've become too pluralistic, we're so complex, it's not easy now to try and fashion a lot of constructive consensus and accord with one another. Well, I think that's a defeatist attitude. Some people would argue that we have so marginalised particular groups and minorities, including women, that all the time we're facing this struggle to assert the common good, because you can't actually assert the dominance of the common good when women, for example, are more likely to live in poverty at the end of their working lives, because many of them are locked out of our so-called fair and universal superannuation system, as one example. So when a large percentage of the population, such as women, and not just women, but such as women, are actually not sharing equal rights as men, then the common good is affected. We have work to do. And naked individualism and the kind of economic libertarianism that we have seen express itself like treacle over our policy landscape over the last 20 years, that kind of naked individualism and assertion of the rights of the individual to do whatever he or she wants in the marketplace, for instance, works against the common good. And you would have seen examples more recently, for example, of particular irrigators stealing huge volumes of water from the Murray-Darling Basin is in fact a corrosion of the common good, that water is there as a vital part of our life and livelihood to be shared by all fairly. So the common good does not miraculously happen. It's not sort of, the immaculate conception. It has to be established. It has to be nurtured, maintained, consolidated, reasserted when it's under attack. And it has to do this by enlisting cooperative effort of individual people and of many, so that every time one man or woman in any day does something that actually goes to the ethos of the common good, that's important. But when organisations do it in a manifold way, with hundreds of volunteers, and do it properly, then that is going to the heart of the common good in huge ways. So the assertion of the common good, it's not a warm, fuzzy term to make us feel good. It's actually, in my view, a very real act of leadership, day-to-day leadership, in terms of our community and society. You can see it being corroded in other ways before our eyes. You see it by having a major two-party system that seems to have lacked the ability now to articulate things with a national purpose. The fact that we seem to have no energy policy in this day and age. We're one of the most affluent countries in the world, but we have a Prime Minister going after gas producers saying, please hold back some of your products so we can have energy over the summer. But probably the worst example currently of the erosion or corrosive effect on the common good is the illegitimate same-sex postal survey, which has brought out unnecessary division, which is a sham, a democratic sham, and it actually does us no good at all. And generally what's happening is that people who see through that and see it for the sham that it is, sadly, we're not actually saying much about it. We're just tooth-sucking. Maybe it's because we feel as though we're a bit too powerless. We see it also in the reports recently of the rampant sexual harassment across our universities, across our community, in our workplaces. We see it through the gender pay gap. We see it through the racism that has been alive and well. We see it in the treatment of our asylum-seeking people who should be processed here in this country with dignity and respect, and not kept in prison conditions for years on end without ever knowing whether there's any hope for their future. We see it in the denigration and the lowering of the bar across social media, the fact that people can't seem to have a decent conversation anymore with someone, and especially if they're using evidence, without being attacked and abused in violent terms. We see it, sadly, in the CFA, with the drama in the report released or leaked to the media last week by Carolyn Taylor. And we see organisations like the CFA and the Fire Brigade, with the unbridled power of some of their union leaders. We see it a good example of the double dominance at play, that where you can have highly masculinised workplaces needing to be dragged kicking and bucking into the future in terms of equality between men and women and respect, which is ultimately respecting the common good. So there's a lot to be said at the moment that what I think is this powerful moral force is actually before our eyes under attack. And I'm reminded of that line from Joni Mitchell's song, that you don't know what you've lost until it's gone. And that's the case with an ethic like the common good, that unless you are vigilant, unless you are working for it and trying to promote it and protect it, and when you see it being corroded and do nothing, but when you see it being corroded before our eyes, it can reach a point where the scales are tipped and we've lost something important in the way we run our lives and do our business with one another. So this brings me back to the importance of volunteering and the critical role it plays in fostering the common good. So it's not just about how many volunteers and how much dollar value to the economy. The underlying raison d'etre, the underlying purpose of volunteering is to affect the common good, to capitalise on the fact that a lot of people do want to work to each other's best sides. They do actually want to work in an altruistic way without giving altruism a bad name or being seen as politically correct behaviour. Volunteering, that's why I was so chuffed to see the definition in Volunteering Australia's manual, that it is essentially about the common good and doing that without money. Volunteering Victoria's material indicates, for example, that volunteers are more likely than non-volunteers to attend community events, provide a service or activity in their local area, that they are more likely than non-volunteers to place trust in another person. They're more likely to have higher levels of satisfaction with their lives. They're more likely to have provided assistance to someone outside of their home. And it says volunteers are happier, healthier, and sleep better than those who don't volunteer. My point about that material lurking in Volunteer Victoria's information is that those are exactly the sorts of underlying parameters that are component parts of the common good, of the benefits to be had by people working together, respecting the other, participating in collective efforts for everybody's benefit and not just acting out of self-interest. Volunteer Victoria recognises that volunteering is a form of civic participation, generating positive practices, social connection and belonging, mediating the negative psychological effects of disadvantage, building what it calls collective efficacy, building on altruism and citizenship, inspiring people to work together to improve community life. So Volunteering Victoria, without actually explicitly describing it thus, is describing the common good and why it's a powerful ethic, because it delivers nothing but benefit. But it's not easy to translate it and affect it. Through the relationship between people in organisations and then volunteers, there is an enormous population of Australians operating daily, weekly, monthly, annually, producing interactions and outcomes which can go to the heart of the common good, either for the better or the worse. So the volunteering relationship can become an important determinant of a positive building and commitment to the common good, or a corrosion of the common good. This formal relationship, working to use Volunteer Victoria's terms, working efficaciously, is probably the most important way we can assert the benefits in Australia of mutuality, shared regard and respect, working together and promoting and protecting the common good. My point here is that by sheer volume alone, sheer population numbers, every day of the week there are millions of Australians who have the capacity to help us have this ethic flourish, take root, flourish and be maintained and protected. It stands to reason that if such organisations get it right in the way they deal with inclusiveness and diversity and racism and sexually abusive attitudes and harassment, then our whole society will have a rippling positive benefit because of the sheer weight of numbers. So if the volunteering component of our country is able to be exemplary in the way it includes people of different backgrounds, races, creeds, and different sexuality, and different levels of disability and geography, then we can only generate benefit beyond the sectors. So I'm reminded in that regard of some of the complexities, though, of dealing with racism and sexism and building genuine diversity. Every one of us has prejudices. They're shortcuts. They're shortcut judgments. We make snap judgments. If you want to read something brilliant in this regard, read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink. We're always making shortcut judgments, and we're all prejudiced in some way. The trick is to recognise our prejudice and where it's come from, and to get it out in what I call dredge and deal. Dredge it up from the surface. Acknowledge to your own self that this is a view you have. Do I want to have that? Is it any use? Is it effective? Is it sitting comfortably with my other values? No, it's not. So I then can choose to get it out, remove it from my makeup. And I can remember doing this as a young country girl, coming from the Western District down to Melbourne Uni and sitting in the cafeteria with men and women from Africa who are studying there. Well, you see, the simple point is that Hayward, where I grew up, is an incredibly boring, drab, monocultural country town. Was then, is now. And so for me, I mean, the only cultural and ethnic diversity in Hayward were some Maltese families that attended the local Catholic church with my mother and myself. And I think I know probably how the yes-no vote is going in Hayward. So when I came away and sat in the union cafeteria with people of colour other than my whiteness, I had to sort that out there and then because I felt uneasy, I felt unnerved. Why? So I dredged my prejudice, my lack of familiarity, got it to the surface, decided I didn't want that because it didn't fit with my other values around social justice, so I dealt with it. And we have to do that actively in terms of our own value set. The same in dealing with sexism and racism. I heard this morning John Fain talking about issues of sexual harassment, and part of the argument coming back, yes, but men also get sexually harassed. Well, yes, some do. But the overwhelming majority of sexism and sexual harassment and violence is by men towards women. That's a reality. And good men who never think of harassing a woman, hitting a woman, punishing a woman, dominating a woman, need to actually recognise that they've sorted that out from themselves. Now they should be helping to sort it out in others. So dredge and deal is one way that we have to work to get genuine inclusiveness. The other one is around diversity by background, diversity by racial background, by ethnicity. And I loved a comment I heard the other week, actually, by an American woman called Laura Liswood, who's written a book called, I think, The Loudest Duck. I've got it on order. But she talks about diversity in a very refreshing way. She talks about the Noah's Ark syndrome. The Noah's Ark syndrome in tackling diversity is two of each. Two of each equals diversity. So on go the elephants, on go the tigers, on go the rattlesnakes, and you've got diversity. And her point is that that's not diversity. It's not diversity, genuine diversity, because what happens is that the zebra can look at the giraffe and say, you're very odd, you've got a very long neck, and that's the extent of the diversity and the rubbing off on one another. And she uses that to segue into the fertile cognitive gains to be had when people genuinely connect with one another in terms of intellectual life, respect for opinions, understanding different cultural traditions and norms, and learning from one another and being open to being enriched by the other. That's genuine diversity. So we have to be proactive in dealing with our prejudices around sexism, around racism, and proactive in understanding that genuine diversity and inclusiveness is not simply looking as though you include people. It's actually about getting a rich mix of thought and opinion that comes from mutual regard and sharing of benefits. And there are tools and strategies. You can't click your fingers and get that kind of genuine diversity. You have to do things to make it happen. I've been given the wind-up. So all I would say, to summarise, is that every one of us, whether we like it or not, whether we've been aware of it or not through our schooling, through our education, higher education, through our training, to be attuned with our values, every one of us is driven by particular values that lurk within our systems, by our belief systems, the assumptions we make, the values. I'm saying that the commitment to the common good is a values proposition, and you choose it or you reject it, or you stay ambivalent about it and remain a bit muddled in how you go about things, I would say. I believe that Volunteering Australia's new definition that volunteering is essentially about the common good is a refreshing and a strong beginning point to reflect on the way volunteers mesh or don't mesh, are supported or not properly supported, are genuinely brought into the richness of an organisation's life, so that everybody benefits by the mutual respect, the regard, the support, the flourishing, the thriving of the human condition. It's not soppy or maudlin or romantic to talk about those deep values. The more we locate ourselves, the more we feel confident and comfortable with the value propositions that we live our personal and professional lives by, the better we will be in terms of being able to bring about the things that we believe improve community life and improve our society. I'd argue, for example, that the malaise we have across our nation in policy terms and political terms is because a lot of our political leaders have forgotten about the fact that their raison d'etre is to affect the common good, not how Tony Abbott feels about his place in the right wing of his party, but the common good, and striving, despite its complexities and difficulties, striving to make sure that each one of us flourishes because of who we are, but because of who we are in our community and how our community is intimately linked to every one of our fortunes. Thank you.